It's Niall Mackay here, your host of a Vietnam podcast, and I am here to give you a very special episode on September 30th, 2024, because today is International Podcasting Day. What does that mean? I have no idea. There's a day for everything. There's Pancakes Day, there's Picture Frame Day, there's a day for everything. But today, September 30th, 2024, is International Podcasting Day. So I'm going to share with you some fun facts and insights about podcasts. I started this podcast, a Vietnam podcast, all the way back now, which I can't believe I'm saying all the way back, but in 2019, started in my front room. I wanted to share stories of people connected to Saigon and connected to Vietnam, and I really had no idea what I was getting myself in for. I'd just always been a massive podcast fan. I love the medium. My first podcast I ever listened to was The Ricky Gervais Show, which went on to be the most downloaded show in the world. Then there was Serial in 2014, which blew up and everybody fell in love with. And then from there, podcasts just grew and grew and grew. My favorite around the time I started mine was The Revisionist History, which I just read about Malcolm Gladwell yesterday. He's bringing out an updated book, and I loved that one. Stage Left was good. They interviewed people who played with famous musicians, but they were stage left. They were the guitarist or the drummer, so they weren't famous themselves. And my biggest one for many years was the Guardian weekly football podcast, which wasn't actually weekly, it was 2 or 3 times a week. I've actually recently dropped that one and now listen to The Rest is Football by Gary Lineker's Goal Hangers podcast. I've been listening to podcasts about dictators, which I love as well. It's called Dictators. And my absolute favorite right now, and I need to give a shout out to Ashley if she's listening, is My Dad Wrote a Porno, which is the most ridiculous concept ever. And I'm actually really embarrassed that I'd never heard of this show. So Ashley told me about it recently. I started listening. And it is literally what the title says. So the main guy, his dad wrote a porno, I think inspired by 50 Shades of Grey, but he calls it, I think, 50 Colours of Grey or something like that. He got his 2 best mates from uni, and the 3 of them sit around a table, which just, again, this is an amazing testament to the power of podcasting and independent podcasting as well, that you can just start with a microphone and your 2 best friends, and the 3 of you sitting around a kitchen table. And if the concept is good and the hosts are funny and they're interesting, it can really, really blow up. And it doesn't happen all the time. It's like gold dust. It's like 1% of podcasts, 0.1% of podcasts. That's going to happen too. But it happened to them. So what they do is they sit around a table and he literally reads porno that his dad wrote, which is just disgusting to say, but that's the fact. And then his 2 mates comment on it. And literally they can't get through 1 sentence without laughing or commenting on it because it's one of the worst books ever written. It's absolutely terrible. And the favorite line I've used lately a lot is he talks about the main protagonist having distressed lettuce. They don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I've never heard of it in my life. So in the last few days, I keep telling Adri, let's have some distressed lettuce for food. But so check that one out. My Dad Wrote a Porno. That went on to have millions of downloads. As I said, I only just found out about it. And then when I looked into it, it came out in like 2016. So it's been out for years. It got its own HBO special. They traveled the world. The episode I'm listening to right now, they're about to go and play in the Sydney Opera House. Perform in the Sydney Opera House and reading it out. They do stage shows. They wrote their own book. And all of that life-changing stuff happened from them starting a podcast. Obviously, I've not had the same level of life-changing experience, but starting a podcast for me absolutely changed my life. I wouldn't be doing what I do today. I've been in TV commercials. I've done voiceover work, things that I would never even have dreamed of. And actually just today, I've been asked to be on a panel to talk about podcasting as well. So things like this, I just would never be able to do. And most of all, the connections and the people that I've got to meet as well has been absolutely incredible. So thank you for listening to this podcast, a Vietnam podcast. I also host another show called Smarter Podcasting, which is about how to make a podcast. So it's a bit meta, but I make a podcast about podcasting. I did make a show called Did That Really Happen, which is still out there. You can look it up. It's a comedy podcast. It's when I was a comedian, which I actually have given up, but I did comedy for the first time on Saturday night in about 1.5 years. And I don't plan to do any more anytime soon. It was a one-off. But it was really fun and I really enjoyed it. And I felt like I hadn't been away at all. So that was quite cool. So a few years ago, I did a podcast called Did That Really Happen? Where I interviewed comedians in Saigon and around the world. And I played one of the jokes and then just simply asked them, did that really happen? And yes or no. Most of the time the answer was yes, and they would explain the real story and how they came up with the joke. And the couple of times where the answer was no, they would still explain how they came up with that joke and what influenced it. So look that one up. I always kind of forget about that one. Did that really happen? It's a really cool concept. I thought it was really fun, but I just got way too busy to keep putting out episodes and obviously stopped doing comedy as well. But in this special episode, I want to share with you some fun facts and insights that we've looked up about podcast. Massive thanks to Huyen Nguyen, our blog writer, content writer, website operator. She's amazing. We couldn't do what we do without her. So thank you very much to Huyen. She put this together for us. So a few stats to start off about a Vietnam podcast. We are on the cusp of hitting 80,000 downloads. To be exact, as of writing today, 78,677 times across all platforms a Vietnam podcast has been listened to, which, when you put it in comparison to these podcasts like the ones I mentioned that get millions of downloads, it doesn't sound that impressive. But when you think that most podcasts get on average about 50 listens per episode, and the fact that we've been going for 5 years and producing pretty consistently, apart from some breaks, 80,000 downloads, that's pretty incredible. So thank you to everyone who's listening right now. Thank you to you for listening right now. Thank you to every single person that's helped make this happen. It's incredible. Number 2 stat on a Vietnam podcast is guest diversity. You've maybe heard me talk about it before, but one of the biggest challenges, I guess, of booking guests is I have a very strict policy on the type of people that I want to interview, because I want to share voices from all different people. And I'm very aware of the fact that I'm a white, cisgender, straight, European male. So I want to give voices to people from all over, not just more white guys. So my biggest thing on a Vietnam podcast is making sure I try to interview, obviously, people from Vietnam, people connected to Vietnam, so whether they're Viet Q, first or second generation Vietnamese, people from the LGBTQ community. I try to have an even split, 50-50 between male and female as well. And just make sure that giving people a voice, because to me that's really important, because I'm sick of people like myself, to be perfectly honest. I think that's what's helped the success of a Vietnam podcast, is by bringing these different voices and sharing their stories. Number 3 is we have been listened to in over 100 countries worldwide and on every continent. I don't have stats for Antarctica, but I'm going to just guess that there's at least one person was in Ross Station, if that's what it's called, and they put on a Vietnam podcast, fingers crossed. So that's really incredible. And I couldn't believe this one. We have produced over 298 episodes. I think this one right now will be 299, which is absolutely mind-blowing. We're about to have a 300th episode. And it's just such a rich and diverse library of aspects of Vietnam, whether it's interviews, history, or current events, or my own stories. So I'm really excited to just keep growing that content and keep sharing those stories. And last one for a Vietnam podcast, as I mentioned, we are 5 years strong, going since 2019. And I haven't confirmed this, but I think we are the oldest continuously running English language podcast in Vietnam. I'm not sure the Bureau Asia could be about the same time or longer. They started about the same time and they're still going. Most of the podcasts that started about the same time as us don't produce episodes anymore. So I think us and the Bureau Asia are the longest running English language podcasts in Saigon or in Vietnam. That's pretty cool. A couple of quick stats on Smarter Podcasting, which comes out less frequently. It's every 2 weeks. I've been doing it for a shorter time, obviously, and it's been a bit up and down, but I'm trying to make it more consistent. So we've now published 28 episodes, and I'm only 12 episodes away from hitting the next major milestone of 50 episodes. And if anyone knows anything about podcasting, there's something called pod fade, which is when podcasts just disappear after 8 episodes because the host or the creators didn't realize how much work it was going to take to make those episodes. And so they just stopped making them. So I was just really proud to get past 10 episodes with that. And we're on our way to hitting 50 very, very soon. We've got the next 6 episodes recorded. And we've got episodes already planned into the new year. And next year's going to be even bigger. And that has a growing international audience as well. It's been listened to in 50 countries. And it just shows you how the love for podcasting is truly global. All right. Now, that's enough about my podcast. Let's get into the podcasting world and the fun facts. Now, I hope that you would know this, but you might not, because I did this question at a quiz recently, and I thought it was like a really easy question. And the question was, where does the word podcast come from? And there was a lot of people that didn't know. And I guess because it comes from a combination of the two words iPod, which if you're old like me, you'll remember the iPods way before the smartphones, and the word broadcast, because podcasts are like a radio station, radio show. Put the two words together, an iPod and a broadcast, and it becomes a podcast. So even though that term has been about since they say 2004, and even though the iPods died a long time ago, they're still called podcasts. Number 2 is the first podcast ever is credited to Dave Weiner and Adam Curry, who's known as the Podfather or the father of podcasting. And in 2004, Curry created a program called iPodder, which allowed him to download internet radio broadcasts to his iPod. And Weiner also contributed by creating the RSS feed for audio. Number 3, podcasts' explosive growth. Podcasting has seen massive growth since its inception. There was a bit of a lull between the Ricky Gervais boom and Serial, and then since the advent of the Serial podcast, since Serial came out in 2004, it's just gone on and on from there. So as of 2023, there are over 5 million podcasts in the world. Not all of them are active, but they're out there, and over 70 million episodes available across all platforms. That's mind-blowing. Number 4, podcasts are global. They truly are an international medium. And some of the most popular podcast markets outside of the US include countries like Brazil, South Korea, Spain, and Australia. And I think it's Indonesia is the fastest growing podcast market in the world. Number 5, one of my favorite stats, listeners love to binge podcasts. Once people start listening, they don't stop. One of the biggest stats that really separates podcasts from YouTube is studies have shown that 80% of listeners will listen to all or most of an episode, no matter how long it is, once they start it. So if you're listening right now, thank you very much. We're about 60% of the way through. Number 6, the most popular podcast genres. Now, everybody loves true crime, but actually the most popular genre globally is labeled as society and culture, which what this podcast comes under as well, followed closely by comedy, news, and true crime. Obviously, true crime podcasts have become especially popular with shows like Serial and My Favorite Murderer reaching massive audiences. And I know my wife's favorite podcast is Psychopedia, which I've listened to a little bit, and it's pretty good as well. Number 7, we can't go through this list without talking about Joe Rogan and Joe Rogan's podcast deal, which he signed with Spotify in 2020 for $100 million, making it one of the largest deals in podcasting history. His show is now available on all platforms and it's listened to worldwide. It's number 1 on the podcast charts nearly every single day. I have no idea why. I don't listen to it, but it's not for me. Number 8, podcasts aren't just audio anymore, and I cringe to say this because I used to be the biggest proponent of podcasts being audio only. It's not a video, as I'm recording this for audio and video right now as well. Unfortunately, we've passed the Rubicon, if that's the right phrase. Podcasting truly is video now, so to me, if you only have a video, you really shouldn't be calling it a podcast, and I still cringe at that. I've seen companies put out a one-off webinar saying that, hey, listen to our podcast, and I'm just like, it's just a webinar, it's not a podcast. But if, like me, you do audio and you record it, and then you put that video out and you make little shorts as well, in my mind, you can still call it a podcast. Number 9, listeners have increased during commutes, which will not surprise you. One of the reasons podcasts have grown so much is because they fit really well with busy lifestyles, and people often listen while commuting, especially in the US when you have car journeys. Here in Vietnam, more and more people are driving, gives you more opportunities to listen in the car, and you can listen on your bike, which you probably shouldn't, but I mean, who doesn't do that here in Vietnam? I always listen to podcasts at the gym or while I'm doing the dishes as well, and that's how I actually came up with the name 7 Million Bikes, was while I was doing the dishes. And I had just read an article that there were 7.3 million motorbikes in Saigon. And I was like, that's a pretty cool name for a podcast. So originally, this podcast was called 7 Million Bikes, a Saigon podcast. It's now just a Vietnam podcast, and 7 Million Bikes podcast is obviously the company that makes this and makes all of the shows that we help produce. Now, number 10, the shortest and longest podcasts. Podcasts, as you probably can imagine, come in all different shapes and sizes and lengths. The shortest podcasts are actually 5 minutes or less, like the Daily Meditation podcast or Daily News podcast, which just give you the quick highlights. And even shows like Case File 83, which I absolutely loved. Julianne Moore, Oscar Isaac. Then it was a serial, fiction podcast. And those episodes were only 7 or 8 minutes long. But one of the longest is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, where episodes can last over 5 hours. We all know the Joe Rogan podcast goes to 2 or 3 hours. And even Stephen Bartlett at Diary of a CEO has started experimenting with long episodes. And apparently they still get a lot of downloads. I think the engagement will be a lot less. And I don't think people are actively listening so much. It's probably on in the background more, but it shows that your podcast can be any length. And it is one of the biggest questions I get when I'm working with new clients is, how long should it be? And it really is, how long is a piece of string? It's completely up to you. It's as long as it needs to be. Number 11, diverse voices in podcasting. Podcasts have given a platform to independent voices, which really helps allow creators from diverse backgrounds share their stories and perspectives without needing to go through the gatekeepers at major media companies and have to get past that to be able to create content. So it really is amazing how podcasting has democratized media in so many different ways. Number 12, podcasts influence buying decisions. Now, you may be sick of listening to ads, but the stats show that podcast listeners really do respond to them, and they're not that much of a discouragement to people listening to them. And at the end of the day, we are all putting out this content for free. You may have heard an ad at the start of this episode. Podcasts, just like all forms of media, can't survive without funding, and unless they have funding from a major corporation or a media company, having advertisers pay a little bit of money for you to listen to those ads then help create this content that you love so much as well. And the research shows that 54% of podcast listeners are more likely to consider buying products that they hear advertised on podcasts, which is why so many brands are now investing in podcast ads. Number 13, podcast listening by demographics. Podcasting is popular across many age groups, but younger audiences, which pains me to say this, is people aged 18 to 34, are actually the largest group of podcast listeners, but people over 50 have been embracing podcasts at a growing rate too. So boomers are enjoying them as well, even though they probably have to ask their children how to set up a podcast and how to open the app, but we won't go into that. Number 14, International Podcast Day involvement. International Podcast Day today, September 30th, has featured participation from over 100 countries and hundreds and thousands of podcasters, showcasing the medium's global reach. From meetups in person to live streams and episodes just like this, today is an event for celebrating the community of podcasters and listeners like you. And last one, number 15, language diversity in podcasts. If you're an English speaker like me, you probably only listen to podcasts in English. You may be Vietnamese or you may speak any other language around the world and still listening to this podcast. But if you speak a language other than English, those podcasts are growing massively as well. And I see that especially here in Vietnam with the amount of Vietnamese podcasts. But although English is the dominant language, there are now podcasts in multiple languages such as Spanish, French, German, Mandarin, and even more, and Vietnamese obviously as well. So this makes podcasting a truly global and multilingual platform. So to wrap up, as we celebrate International Podcast Day, it's a perfect time to reflect on the incredible impact that podcasting has had on connecting people around the world, sharing their stories, and amplifying voices from every corner of the globe that may never have been heard before. So whether you're a listener or a podcast creator, podcasts have become a vital part of how we learn, how we laugh, and how we engage with the world around us. For the past 5 years, a Vietnam podcast has been absolutely privileged to be part of this thriving community and to share diverse stories from expats, travelers, and locals who all share a deep love for Vietnam. Smarter Podcasting 2 is developing into an invaluable tool, helping thousands of podcasters around the world make the best podcast possible. So thank you to you for listening. Thank you for your support. And I also need to add a massive, massive thank you to the team at 7 Million Bikes Podcast who make this podcast possible. And that's Huynh Nguyen, Chelsea Conquesa Joy, and our newest editor, Niall, who's going to be editing some of these podcasts soon. And to everybody along the way who's helped us. So I remember Luke Digweed was an editor for a while. We've had Calvin Lewis helped us with social media. anyone who I've missed, who I can't think of, thank you so much for everything you've done to help make this podcast possible. And it goes without saying, of course, my number one fan who listens to every episode on her way to work, commuting, as we talked about, my amazing wife, Adria Lopez Mackay. Thanks again to you for listening. I really, really appreciate it. So if you have any questions about podcasting at all, any comments, or you're even thinking about starting your own show, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. The link will be in the show notes. Thank you again for listening. And don't forget, subscribe, follow, turn on notifications, and please, on Podcasting Day, International Podcasting Day, please share this episode with as many people as possible. Cheers.